Here is Vinta Piloncitos. I'm sure I butchered that. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
I'm not completely sure if I'm disappointed with this or if I had so much disappointment from Vinta Julio that it carried over. This is a green and a shimmer, and I like both green and shimmer inks, yet was still disappointed. There is tone variation from every pen, which at times is thankful, and it does shade fairly well. Now on non-fountain pen friendly paper, hold on to your boots, I think it generally performs or looks better, and sometimes I can even see the shimmer on the non-fountain pen friendly paper. As far as this ink goes, it for me is a hard pass. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Mnemosyne Singularity.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, this is a nice mid-tone for what we're gonna get. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. We are getting the shimmer coming through fairly evenly throughout, not overdone and not barely there. The shading is pretty good, and you see it even with the shimmer, better than expected. Looking at expected on the first line, where the E is quite a bit lighter, that cross of the X got very dark. Little darker on the P than the E, lightens up into the EC, TE darkens a little bit, and that D at the end does become quite a bit lighter. Looking at the medium nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the extra fine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does have the shimmer that you would expect, and yes, it does shade fairly well, leaving everything undamaged on the third line, undamaged. The is a little bit darker than the beginning of the D that starts to lighten up. It's that up and down stroke of the D becomes quite a bit darker. The AMA in the middle gets quite a bit lighter. The JED at the end darkens up quite a bit. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than the medium, lighter than the extra fine. It does not feather, does not spread. The shimmer's there, not incredibly, but it is there. It does shade fairly well. I think in some areas much better than others. And sometimes when it shades, it's not nice. It's mournful even, like mournful on the second line, where the M is a mid-tone maybe, for it's light, and then it gets even lighter, really, with the O-U-R-N lightening all the way through. The F does become a nice darker letter, but the U lightens up quite a bit. The L becomes very dark at the end again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 5 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Very nice tone that we're getting here. I think a better tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread. I am seeing shimmer when I get this to the right light. I don't think it's going to come through on camera, but I am getting shimmer on this paper, which I wouldn't expect because it's a more absorbent paper than the fountain pen friendly stuff. Shades just as well, if not a little better than it did on the Clairfontaine. I have no complaints, and I'm not even pointing you to the word complaints on the first line with some very nice shading, where the COM is a nice mid-tone. The PL darkened just a little bit. The AI become quite a bit lighter into the end, but the TS do show quite a bit of the darker tones. Looking at the medium nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade fairly well. It does show the shimmer on this paper. Another pleasant surprise, really elevating this paper and quite possibly saving this ink for me. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. There is some shimmer. I'm going to take that back. There's quite a bit of shimmer actually coming through. While it looks very light to look at on an angle, you really do see the shimmer coming through. This paper's done so well with this shimmer ink. Is it shading? It is shading, not especially well, but you do see it shading, like especially on the first line, where the E is quite a bit darker than the S. The P goes to a nice mid-tone, but it lightens up into the ECIA, but the LL darkens a little bit. The first one a little bit, the second one quite a bit, and then a little bit darker still with the Y at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue writing back here.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Papier Plume Caramel. Here is Private Reserve Copper Burst. Here is Roher & Klinger Document Brown. Here is Schaefer Brown.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Levenger Pinkley. Here is Robert Oster Green Green. Here is Diamine Golden Honey. Here is Califolio Cassis.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was with the Clairfontaine and very usable. Now, there's almost no feathering. There is a little bit of spread, but I think the spread is helping this out. Do you want to hear even more? Shimmer is able to be seen on 20-pound copy paper. Yes, I know. That makes this a great ink to use on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There's a tiny, it's really imperceptible. It's not worth mentioning, but there is some feather. There is some spread. The spread is helping it, I think, here. And the shimmer, I see the shimmer coming through. Now, the shading is not anything stand out. It's not a big deal. To me, the bigger deal is that this ink does better on non-fountain pen friendly paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium or the extra fine, just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. I find it so light, it's really dull and uninteresting here. It's not the best combination for this paper, especially considering how it was before. Now, there's no feathering. There is a slight bit of spread. The shimmer does come through. Shading is almost non-existent. I mean, you could use this if you wanted an incredibly understated tone on the page, which is what you would get. Looking at the back of the page, the only thing that could have made this better is if it didn't get so deep into the paper, but it's 20-pound copy paper. What are you going to do? You probably can't write on the back with the extra fine or the medium. Maybe you could with the stub, but you could barely read it on the front. It did not bleed through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine gave the mid-tone for this ink, and it shaded. Now, the medium was the darkest tone, and the shading, I think, looked the best. The stub was the lightest tone with some shading. It wasn't really as standout as I would have hoped for. Now, of what we've seen, I would say you need to go with the medium nib, but I think what we really need here is more ink. I got a fever. I'm not doing cowbell for it. We need more ink, so I would recommend a very wet pen to darken it up and really show off the green that I think this ink could be and let that shimmer come through.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.